Chapter 4 Marjorie's Discovery. Marjorie yawned and stretched and looked over at Penny, who was rubbing her eyes. "Sleep well?" "Okay, I guess," Penny replied. She decided to keep the events of the previous night to herself. "Oh, Penny, think of all we've got to look at and find out. Those trunks and boxes. It's better than a grandmother's attic." "Isn't it?" agreed Penny. "And we'd better get at it, too. And I do want to discover that cabin before Jimmy does." "Why?" "Oh, just because. Are we going to stay up here all winter, Penny?" "Don't ask me. Who knows what we're going to do? We'll just all have to sit down and discuss it pretty soon. It can't be put off forever." "What's that, Penny?" came the question from Phil. "Want fish for breakfast?" "No, and don't you and Jimmy go off in that boat. Remember that Mr. Ryan is coming over bright and early to have a business conference with all of us." Okay, Penny. No idea of getting out in the boat. Besides, Jimmy's not up yet." "Wonderful!" cried Marjorie, hurrying into a pair of blue jeans and an old shirt of Jimmy's. Then she darted out of the trailer and down the path which led to the garage. She didn't stop there, but went on along the path between neatly trimmed bushes and tall trees. Overhead she could hear the early morning songs of the birds. Presently she reached a little clearing, only a patch in the woods, and there it stood, the place she had been so anxious to reach before the others. It was the small log cabin, looking much like the shack they had expected to find instead of the large house. She stood there a moment with her hands on her hips. "Who's this trespassing on our property?" called a familiar voice behind her. Marjorie whirled and laughed when she saw it was Phil and Jimmy. "Found it first," she said. "Beat you this time, Jimmy." "So I see. And left me out of it." He raised his voice in a loud wail. "Hey, Jim, let up on that. They can hear you all the way to Detroit. Besides, the neighbors will wonder what foghorn that is." "I saw you racing down here, Marge," Phil interrupted, "and wondered if you were on an exploring trip into the woods. Be careful when you do explore, kid. It would be all too easy to lose your way," he cautioned his little sister. "I will, Phil. Thanks for the warning." "Gee, this is a super cabin," remarked Jimmy, who had left the other two to peek through the windows. "What do you say we go in?" "Haven't got my keys," answered Philip. "You know, this is just what I expected to find instead of the other house." "Why, Phil, that's just what I said to myself. Next summer we can live here and fill the whole house with guests." "Don't go too fast, Marjorie. But you do have ideas." "I wonder if Uncle John built all this or bought it," said Jimmy. "Mr. Ryan said," began Marjorie slyly, "that he and Uncle John often stayed in this cabin. Perhaps the house was too big." "So that was how you heard about this, young lady," burst out Jimmy. "Well, Phil, it's just another asset. Let's go back and have breakfast, and then look this over inside." "Oh, breakfast! And Penny getting it all alone!" With this, Marjorie whirled and ran back toward the house. But Jimmy and Phil looked around the cabin, glancing through the windows. On their way back, Jimmy asked, "Did anybody ever stay up here in the winter?" "Not that I ever heard of. Who would in a place just built for summer pleasure?" "Gosh, I've read about great times with winter sports in Canada and our northern states. What are we going to do, Phil?" "Search me. That's what we've got to find out. I'm thinking about it, but I don't feel like selling this place. Do you?" "Yipes, no! Margie's right. It really would make a good business next summer. I bet we could get a lot of our friends to come up here." "We'll write to them all while our enthusiasm is fresh," laughed Philip. "Sailing, fishing, hunting, gorgeous scenery wherever you look. What more could any vacationist want? I'm really sold on the idea. But how are we going to get through the winter without using up more of our little capital? The rent's settled, said Jimmy, and fishing gets our food. But we've got to have gas and oil and antifreeze for our car, buy a snowplow to dig us out, run the electric plant, and the usual things that nobody thinks about, but they'll come along just the same. Well, at least we're getting a lot of experience, aren't we? How about getting a job for the winter? And leave the girls up here by themselves? Sell fish to the markets? And try something we don't know anything about? Well, what do we know about? Not much, I must admit. Could you run this place with the girls, Jim, while I worked somewhere? I might get work in one of those boat-building concerns. I'd try if I had to, said Jimmy thoughtfully. I'd rather have the job, really. But yeah, I'll do anything. We'll have to find out a lot from Pat. By the time they had returned to the main house, Marjorie was making toast. The cocoa was giving forth a delicious odor, and the eggs were done. That is all you get, boys, this morning, Penny informed them. Cocoa, eggs, toast, and all the jelly you want. Pat will be over any minute, you know. But Pat, who was to be over so early, didn't come and didn't come, as Marjorie put it. The boys were restless and could not keep away from the boathouse, the center of attraction for them at present. Knowing that they would feel that way about it, Penny shooed them from the kitchen, saying that she and Marjorie would clean up after breakfast and that they had all sorts of investigations of their own to make. Girl stuff, said Jimmy. Have a good time, then. Come on, Phil. But the boys, after satisfying themselves that the boat was really there and looking it over again, decided that they might as well renew the supply of fuel for the fireplace and went back into the woods. It took both of them to carry one huge log from a pile in the woods, where Pat had been thinning out the trees scientifically, Phil said. They added it to a fine pile of dry fuel already near the cabin, under the woodshed. Promptly after the kitchen was put in order, Marjorie and Penny heard the sound of a car, an old Ford. But to their surprise, it was not driven by Pat. Instead, a neat figure in a dark wool skirt and jaunty yellow coat whisked out of the old car and ran up the steps of the porch. Penny was just emerging from the kitchen door with some wet dish towels and smiled at her caller. "Good morning," she said, with a glance at the car. Pat's car, quite evidently. "I am Anne Mary," promptly replied the caller, with a little nod at Penny and Marjorie, who just appeared in the doorway. "I came to tell you that Pat has been called away suddenly and can't come over this morning. He's sorry and told me to be sure to come. Of course I would anyway." "My, but Anne Mary is pretty," thought Marjorie. Eyes larger and of a deeper blue than Pat's were framed in long black lashes. Her face was round and plump. She was of medium height, stood as straight as Pat, and was quite as direct in her manner. "Come in, please," said Penny. "We have so much to ask about, and perhaps you can tell us as well as Pat." Anne Mary came in and sat down on the chair indicated by Penny. The large kitchen, with its tiled white walls and gay red cupboards, was an inviting place, though Penny apologized for not having everything in order. They had been bringing in some of their supplies from the trailer, she explained, and had not yet found places for them. "Did you travel in that big thing out front?" asked Mary, full of interest. "Yes. I'll show you all the gadgets in it and how compact it is, if you'd like to see." Like old friends, Penny, Marjorie, and Anne Mary went through to the front, and the whole trailer arrangement was explained. Anne Mary was entirely approving and said that she envied them. "I suppose you wouldn't sell it if you're going to stay here?" she asked. Surprised, Penny said she had not thought of it and went on to declare that they had no idea what they were going to do, but were glad to find a home like the present one. "Do you know anybody that would want to buy a trailer?" "It's fine. Pat and I might use it for a wedding trip, and a home after that. We've been engaged for the last 10 years, but Pat looks after Teresa." How old was Anne Mary? Her face was so young and smooth, and her ways so brisk. No wonder Pat liked her. Finally, they came down to the real business of the moment. Philip and Jimmy came around to be introduced, and they all sat on the front porch to talk. Anne Mary gave her messages from Pat, which included facts about the electric and water systems. They were just to watch out and not fool with them any. Everything was in order, and when Mr. Allen had been up for his usual fishing, he and Pat had had their usual good time and fixed up the whole place. "Even so," said Philip, "I want to see Pat about his care of everything this summer." "You'll not find it a big bill," said Anne Mary. "Pat went ahead and planted the little garden back of the small cabin, so he owes you rent for the ground. And you'll find some things in it yet, if the frost hasn't got it." "I'm thinking that Pat doesn't owe us any rent," said Philip, smiling. "But we'll take all that up when Pat comes back. How soon will he be in, do you think?" "He said he might be gone several days. He's fishing at the upper end of the lake, you see. A party of 4 men came up here unexpectedly and wanted Pat to pilot their boat." "Are there any girls of about my age up here?" asked Marjorie, who had chosen her seat close to Anne Mary. Philip and Jimmy jumped up and were about to excuse themselves when Anne Mary raised her hands to indicate that there was something more. "Not many around here at any time, though they do say that the girl that was lost from your nearest neighbors was expected to stay all winter. I'll tell you about her sometime. Just one thing I ought to mention, I suppose. You'll hear that this house is supposed to be haunted, so I might as well tell you that if it is, nothing ever happens to hurt anyone. I've slept here myself, when Teresa and I were cleaning up." "Oh!" softly exclaimed Marjorie, and Penny frowned. She would have preferred that Marjorie did not hear any such stories, particularly since Marjorie herself was imaginative to start with. But Penny tossed her head and laughed. "I don't believe in haunts, Anne Mary. What an asset that will be, boys, with our friends, if we want to have everybody up here next summer. Remember all the picnics we used to have at the haunted house on the river?" Marjorie was looking wide-eyed, first at Anne Mary, then at Penny. "Would it be funny to find out about a ghost, Penny?" she asked seriously. "Sure, Marjorie, for they always turn out to be something perfectly simple." "Not in the old country, they don't," said Anne Mary. "I could tell you—" Anne Mary broke off, for Marjorie leaned almost in her lap to look up and say, "Oh, tell me, Anne Mary," at the same time that Penny gave Anne Mary a warning look and a little shake of her head toward Marjorie. "Not now, Marjorie," said Anne Mary, "for I must get home as soon as I show your sister where some of the things are. But I've a lot of jolly stories about Ireland that I'll tell you some day." End of chapter 4.